This has got to be one of the most interesting videos I've done, well, that I found interesting personally, in my entire time that I've been doing Terraria videos. This is my top 10 plus Terraria weapon showcase that the weapons do 1 million plus in damage. And in fact, one exceeded my expectations by a long shot. So, enjoy. The Penetrator is probably one of the most interesting and suggestive weapons I've ever shown on this channel. It requires, skill to use. It's kind of hard to get like where you want to go exactly, but if you're fighting a bunch of enemies like an event or something, like this would be really good for that. And here's a real kicker. This weapon in Terraria has nearly hit the 100 mil DPS. If you're looking very closely, and when they're going through the line, like that huge line of dummies, and it starts to slow down, at one point it reaches 96 million DPS. Just 3 point some million short of the 100 million mark. Apotheosis is honestly a pretty interesting weapon. Not as interesting as the last weapon, or even interesting in the same way, but it is effective nonetheless. It can reach 10 million plus DPS depending how and when you use it. Celestus is a pretty interesting item. It fluctuates in its DPS, so it's not as effective as the previous ones. However, if there is a large event taking place, like a solar event, or there's just a lot of enemies on the field, it'll do 1 million plus DPS pretty easily. However, if there's not that many enemies, like if there's like 1 or 2, it might struggle to reach the 1 million DPS mark. Gaels Greatsword is pretty good. Not as great as the previous items, but still pretty good. The projectiles make it unpredictable, though. If you're relying on distance, this ain't going to be that good of a weapon. But if you're close, you can reach 1 to 3 million DPS, depending on how many enemies there are. Slime Rain is a very interesting weapon. It is basically a bunch of blue bouncy balls, kind of like those rubber balls that just bounce on the ground. Yeah, kind of like that, but they do a lot of damage for some reason. And depending on the amount of enemies, this can easily get 1 million plus DPS with very few enemies out there. However, if there's a crap ton of enemies, this Slime Rain can easily reach 10 million plus DPS. Elemental Excalibur has pretty tough competition. 3 weapons so far have reached the 10 million plus DPS mark. This one, however, will fall short. The attacks are pretty interesting, although they will not go through the ground. It will pierce enemies, just not the ground. So, if you have a decent amount of enemies lined up in a row, this can reach 2 to 6 million DPS pretty easily. Ataraxia is a little bit lackluster compared to the previous items in the showcase, but it is still pretty decent, at least up close. The projectiles and the way it functions does not allow for a lot of DPS over a widespread area. This is more focused, so more skill based. The admin sword is pretty bare bones. It's large and very fast, although it's pretty basic. Doesn't really have anything special effects or anything that makes it stand out. The DPS on it can reach 1.8 to 3 or 4 million DPS, depending on the amount of enemies that are nearby. Hammer of Might is a very powerful weapon. Depending on how many enemies you got lined up in a row, the more DPS it does. You know, if you have only a few, it can reach around 1 million DPS. If you have 5, 6, 7, it can reach 5 to 6 million DPS. If you have a huge amount of enemies all grouped together in a row, it can reach 30-some million DPS. It's very powerful. And the fourth weapon to reach 10 million plus DPS. Svantechnical is pretty good. It's the first ranged item in the showcase, and it does 2 to 3 million DPS, even with the few amount of enemies it is able to actually hit. So, pretty good. The Exoblade is pretty powerful. The projectile that's coming off the sword as you swing it can reach around 1.5 million DPS. Now, once you get close, depending on the amount of enemies that are close by, on top of the projectile hitting it, it can reach 2 to 3 million DPS. So overall, it's pretty good. The Earth is a pretty interesting light show. Pretty powerful when there's a decent amount of enemies. However, there's 1 or 2, you can barely reach the 1 million DPS mark. However, if there's a bunch of enemies clustered together, you can reach several million DPS. However, when you're swinging, you gotta be hitting something in order for the light show to fall from the sky. Otherwise, you ain't getting nothing. And for the last one on the list, the Pumpkin Yo-Yo. It's going to range around 1.5 to 2.5 million DPS. However, it is still very powerful. Do not let that low DPS margin compared to some of the other ones on this list show or make you think any less of it. It can literally just hover the yo-yo in air for an indefinite amount of time and just spam a bunch of those flying pumpkin yo-yo projectiles. As soon as something spawns, it's gone. That is it for this interesting showcase. I believe 4 of the items on this list have reached the 10 million DPS, while 2 have reached the 30 million DPS, and 1 has reached the 90 million plus DPS, which is honestly shocking that that one nearly got 100 million DPS. And honestly, if I think the game could have handled it better, I bet you would have probably been pretty easy to get that item to, what would it be, 100 million plus DPS, because I don't think some of the hits were registering. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you guys got any suggestions, let me know in the comment section below. I think that's pretty much it for this video. Have a nice day.